So it is Dino-gen's first Halloween. It's an active channel anyway. So let's get a little spooky. So cryptozoology is a movement that aims to prove the existence of any organism whose only evidence is anecdotal. Famous examples include Bigfoot or the Loch Ness monster. Now, cryptid sightings go back almost as far as human history, with stories of mystical beasts being passed down and recorded for as long as humans have had complex language. They've been stories from the likes of dragons to sea monsters sinking ships and preying upon sailors, and even chimeras who offer humans riddles. First, what are my thoughts on it? Well, cryptozoology is, and there's no way around this, a pseudoscience. Now, I don't want to come across like I'm taking a hard stance against it, because I'm not, and I'll explain why in a minute. Nor do I mean that in a derogatory or insulting way. The definition of a pseudoscience is setting out to prove something with scientific knowledge, but not necessarily using the scientific method. The scientific method, first and foremost, tests and retests in order to prove or disprove a hypothesis, then records any and all results before assessing how conclusive it is, and then finally it is peer reviewed. The reason I feel that cryptozoology is a pseudoscience is because those who study it, 99% of the time, set out only to find proof of a preconceived notion and interpret inconclusive evidence with a heavy amount of bias, whilst ignoring or not even searching for ways to disprove it. In other words, too many people are a little bit too biased to be considered as doing the scientific method properly. The problem that stands in the way of validity nowadays is how much we've explored the natural world and found out about how it works. Generally speaking, a species cannot last very long without quite high numbers that do not share a close enough gene pool. Most of these cryptids have sightings that are so excessively rare that it seems to be that each one only exists in numbers of single digits. So the likelihood of them being able to live or breed for long enough to keep those sightings alive are not great. Now, even if these numbers are incredibly low and they're somehow surviving, sightings would be a lot more common, especially with terrestrial cryptids. They only seem to exist in particular areas, and while some of these places are big, like the vast forests of North America, they're still limited spaces. Let me put it this way. Open up a browser and search up pictures of Amur leopards. You're going to see a lot of high resolution pictures taken by wildlife photographers with a lot more patience than me. These big cats exist all across Russia, China and North Korea. Lone hunters, and across all of that vast space, there are only estimated to be 100 adults in the wild. 100 across 3 massive countries. Spotting one in daylight lighting good enough for HD cameras has similar odds to winning the lottery, yet Google Images is full of them. But for cryptids that exist within a couple of forests or a single lake, only yields one blurry picture every century. I'll let you decide on the plausibility of that. There's also the fact that animals leave behind evidence of their existence other than their physical body all the time. Footprints, waste, evidence of feeding, just evidence of going about their day. Any organism, no matter how big or small, have effects on the environment around them. We'd be seeing a lot more of that, as well as fossil evidence, especially animals that went extinct but are believed to be still alive. But there are exceptions to that last bit, which I will get into. But again, this doesn't mean that cryptozoology doesn't have its place and that the believers are wrong all of the time. But before I get into that, I want to take a look at some of the more famous cryptids and see what they could be, as well as evidence that goes against their existence and how they could hypothetically exist in today's world. So the Loch Ness Monster, or Nessie, is an aforementioned example and one of two that would come into anyone's mind. Nessie is a creature that is said to live in the Scottish Highland lake known as Loch Ness. Now, accounts of the creature stretch back as far as 565 CE, with descriptions ranging slightly but generally depicting an aquatic organism with flippers, a roundish body, a long neck with a small head. Sound familiar? One thing that isn't quite as clear is the size. Testimonies place this animal anywhere between 2 and 100 foot long. Maybe it was cold some days. Accounts of similar creatures exist around the world too, like the Brosno dragon, Cadborosaurus, or America's own Nessie, known as Champy. You probably have an idea of what it looks like without the description though, with pictures like the surgeon's photograph, which was now found to be a hoax, being synonymous with the famous creature. Also, look at the ripples, this thing is tiny. Regardless, it does help to perpetuate the myth no matter what your belief, as tourism can be a powerful thing, which might explain why not many locals will argue against its existence. Anyway, I don't think I need to tell anyone who's into fossils that Nessie is identical to a plesiosaur. In fact, it is cited by most as being a living plesiosaur. The issue I have with that, which is another common issue with cryptids I'll come back to, is that descriptions from a certain time describe the kind of animal that we thought was true at the time. Namely a plesiosaur with a very flexible and snake-like neck, which we now know they didn't have. In fact, they couldn't even lift their entire necks above the waterline like we see in many pictures. And funnily enough, descriptions have changed somewhat to suit what we currently know about the animals. Now, if we humour the notion that plesiosaurs did actually survive the KPG mass extinction and somehow avoid fossilisation whilst living in the lochs of Scotland, how could this thing be living? Well, for a start, it would need to be a lot smaller than most plesiosaurs we see from the Mesozoic. This is because of energetic dwarfism. The most well-known example of this is island or insular dwarfism, where large animals get very small due to lack of resources. This can also happen with relatively small bodies of fresh water. Now, Loch Ness is a big lake, the biggest in the UK actually, but the food available here for an apex predator is too limited for an average-sized plesiosaur to live on without eating itself out of existence. It's going to need a body that uses less calories, but some testimonies do state it is quite a small animal. Another adaptation it would need would be for the marine transition. Plesiosaurs were marine animals and we don't currently know of any freshwater ones, so it would need to make that transition. Now, air-breathing vertebrates are much more resilient to this change, and going from marine to freshwater is easier since there's less salt to deal with, so that's fine. The issue here is that a plesiosaur wouldn't have flip-flopped across miles of land just to get into a lake. An aquatic group would have needed to stay in that area when it was still connected to the sea. The only problem is that Loch Ness is one of many long thin lakes that formed as a result of the Great Glen Fault, which formed during the Silurian and Devonian, long before reptiles even existed. Now, the only way that something like the Loch Ness Monster could exist would be that it isn't a plesiosaur, but does look similar as a result of convergent evolution. A time when reptiles were extraordinarily big, diverse, and with long necks was during the Mesozoic. Sauropods existed and thrived across Europe, including ancient Scotland. So if some sort of ecological pressure pushed a certain group to gradually adapt to the freshwater lakes of Scotland, I can imagine that a sauropod with aquatic adaptations could look very similar to a plesiosaur. But it would also need quite a bit more blubber to deal with the current low temperatures that Scotland has. You know what they say about big feet. It starts folklore legends that breed really obsessed enthusiasts that camp out all day and night, as well as uncanny valley family films. Bigfoot, often called Sasquatch, is another that has a few species that exist across its cryptogenus, such as the Yeti. Cryptogenus. That is an awesome term that I've just made up. I'm keeping it. Thought to exist in various forested areas, Bigfoot appears to be some sort of upright, bipedal, obligate primate, keeping very secretive, likely living some sort of omnivorous lifestyle, and is even said to be able to mimic human sounds. Now, this is where the ecological evidence argument is a little bit weaker than with Nessie, because North America is a very big place. The forests span for thousands of acres with an extraordinarily vast diversity of fauna and flora. Seriously, I think that the natural beauty of North America is incredible. And depending on where you are, also varies in climate. Evidence other than direct physical presence is much harder to disprove just because it isn't found. But still, this is where cryptozoologists are idiot loser virgins, because the idea that a primate could tower over a human when stood fully upright is stupid, and nothing like that has ever existed. Shit. In the forests of Eastern Asia, between 2.5 million and 11,000 years ago, existed a gigantic relative of today's orangutans, Gigantopithecus blacki. Gigantopithecus is one of the more recent famous giants and even featured in the live-action Jungle Book film. Now this was a big boy, standing at around 10 feet tall on average. So given the similarities to accounts of Sasquatch, a Bigfoot isn't too hard to imagine. The only difference being that Gigantopithecus was most likely quadrupedal due to its size, and it would have resembled a giant orangutan. But Bigfoot being bipedal at this size is far from out of the question, and if it made a transition from an arboreal to ground-dwelling lifestyle like humans, being bipedal is pretty handy. Or footy. Now, primates have existed in North America for as long as 43 million years. And again, the US is an extraordinarily vast and diverse place. So there's lots of opportunity for diversification and enough resources to support hominoids the size of Gigantopithecus. So one of these apes could have made similar adaptations to the genus Homo. In fact, they could have beaten us to the punch on this continent, since humans aren't even thought to have arrived here until 14,000 years ago. Having said that, two animals that are this similar in terms of ecology, locomotion and overall morphology are going to come to blows. This is why I think that a Sasquatch evolving here would need to be primarily herbivorous, evolving an instinctual shyness and possibly nocturnality to avoid human hunters, because we are really good at being dicks to animals. So logically speaking, there's not a lot to say that a Sasquatch couldn't hypothetically exist. The notion isn't that ridiculous. Again though, I do come back to my example of the Amur leopards. North America is one of the most urbanised and explored places in the world. One would have been pictured a little better by now. Now here is one I love. Griffins aren't really thought to exist with as much dedication as the previous entries, but this was a mythical creature that had zero doubt with regards to its existence once upon a time. Whilst the legend of the Griffin could have originated entirely from someone's vivid imagination, the perpetuation of the creature wasn't from a hoax, but in fact stemmed from actual fossil evidence. Ever heard of the Silk Road? If not, it is a very long network of roads running across all of Asia and connected to the east of Europe via land. It's one of the most economically important historical methods of commerce, as it was originally used as a trade route spanning continents from around 200 BCE right up until the 18th century. Precursors to this also existed for millennia before that. It was around 700 BCE that Greek explorers / traders told stories of this chimera, claiming to have found bones from a creature that was the size of a wolf, as well as being quadrupedal in nature and clearly shown to have had claws, a bird-like beak and wings. This became known as the Griffin. Now, if any of that at all sounds familiar, take a look at this guy. That is a Protoceratops androsai, a wolf-sized ceratopsian from the Cretaceous found across Asia, in many locations close to the Silk Road network, complete with claws, beak and quadrupedal gait. The wings, okay, not so much, but it was suggested that it was in fact the neck frill or shoulder girdle that was misinterpreted as wings. Now, the suggestion that the legend of the Griffin stemmed from a fossil of a Protoceratops has been called into question. However, if it was, it makes a nice change that an ancient cryptid was stemmed from actual fossilised remains, rather than someone seeing a pretty picture of a prehistoric animal and wanting it to still exist, or a coincidentally similar organism being discovered after the fact. It also begs the question of the origin of other mythical beasts. Were various depictions of dragons inspired by fossilised remains? It definitely makes sense, especially when you look at a sauropod neck or a theropod skull. Another popular theory is that the legend of the Cyclops, a one-eyed giant from Greek and Roman mythology, was born from the remains of a mastodon or mammoth skull, with the nasal passages being mistaken for eye sockets. Now this one is slightly lesser known than the others. The Mokele-mbembe is a cryptid from the Congo River Basin and it's just flat out a sauropod. The name roughly translates to one who stops the flow of rivers, and depending on who you ask, is either a physical entity or a spirit. An expedition was once made by a group of cryptozoologists, funded by the young Earth creationists, to find the Mokele-mbembe in an effort to disprove the theory of evolution. Of course, no matter the outcome, this would always have failed, as put by paleontologist Donald Prothero, who said that even if it was found, there would be nothing that disproves evolution. Just a sauropod descendant that had survived. Now this particular dinosaur-based cryptid, I think, reeks of creationist pseudoscience. Firstly, the very first account is from 1909, when big game hunter Carl Hagenbreck heard two separate accounts from locals of a river-dwelling creature that would attack all who were unlucky enough to come across it, known as Mokele-mbembe. He said they described it as a half-elephant, half-dragon, and immediately decided that that could only mean some sort of sauropod. Now this was obviously a biased interpretation of an extraordinarily vague description during a time when dinosaurs had first become a worldwide sensation. I doubt the locals even meant what he had interpreted, since the description could conjure up any number of beasts if one didn't know what a dinosaur looked like. He coupled this description with the fact that it was semi-aquatic, which was a belief about sauropods at the time. It just so happens that all accounts that describe it as being dinosaur-like were from around this time, after the idea was already planted. And secondly, there is the depiction. The Mokele-mbembe is described later on as having 4 legs, a roundish body and a long slender neck, with sketches such as this being reported as looking just like it. When you consider it as also a semi-aquatic animal, it becomes very clear that this sauropod was conveniently just like the depictions of sauropods that paleontologists thought to be true at the time. We now know that their bodies didn't quite look like that, their tails didn't drag across the floor, their necks were not that skinny and noodle-like, and they most certainly were not semi-aquatic. Thought once upon a time to be the only way to support their massive weight before the discovery of the avian air sac system. So now the depiction of the Mokele-mbembe is no longer based on an animal of the past, but an outdated interpretation. Not that the young Earth creationists would know that. Now we are getting into really spooky territory. The Mothman is a cryptid that starts to verge on the supernatural. In 1966, accounts were given of a man-sized bird creature something being seen in the area of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. A year later, several sightings were allegedly made around the time and place of the tragic collapse of the Silver Bridge, resulting in the death of 46 people and the belief that the sighting of the Mothman was an omen of death. Even today, this town celebrates Mothman as an integral part of their modern culture, building statues and holding festivals. Descriptions vary somewhat between different accounts, but it's generally described as a man-sized winged humanoid with glowing red eyes and can act very aggressively. Now, first up, a possible explanation was given by biologist Robert L. Smith, when he said that this could have been mistaken for a sandhill crane, which are almost as tall as a human and even have red coloration around their eyes. But that explanation is boring, so let's come up with something a bit more speculative. From the descriptions of the Mothman, I think that the possibility of it being a mistaken bird is a logical one, but the descriptions do sound a little more robust than a crane. Now, flying birds reaching these sorts of gargantuan sizes isn't unheard of throughout natural history. The largest wingspan seen in the fossil record belongs to Pelagornis sandersi, with a wingspan of 21 feet, and the heaviest bird being Argentavis magnificans at around 160 pounds and a wingspan of up to 20 feet. Now, under low light, the influence of adrenaline and at a flashing glance, a bird's wings could resemble a moth's. But the problem we run into is the face. From reconstruction shown, this guy didn't have much of a neck, a very round face and massive eyes. And what bird has a very round face, not much of a neck and massive eyes? Owls. Pretty simple here. I think if the Mothman did exist, it's not some sort of supernatural entity, it's a giant owl. These guys are excellent at camouflage and often nocturnal, meaning that sightings would be rare and an owl of this size would probably see humans as prey, explaining the aggressive nature. And the eyes? Well, given owls' nocturnal nature, the eyes are very large and have a larger tapetum lucidum, which is the structure that bounces unabsorbed light within the eyeballs so it has more of a chance of being seen. One side effect is that when a bright light is shown at an eyeball with a large tapetum lucidum, it can give the appearance of glowing eyes. And if enough blood vessels are being reflected, that glow would appear red. Now, if you get a little bit icky at the mention of blood, I am going to be mentioning sanguivary or blood feeding, so you have been warned. Here we have a younger cryptid, with the first sightings first occurring in 1995. The Chupacabra is a South American cryptid whose name literally translates to goat sucker, and is a creature who is the bane of farmers since it feeds on livestock, namely feeding on their blood. Now, this is another whose physical appearance varies a lot. South American descriptions largely describe it as being around 4 foot tall, hops around like a kangaroo, and having leathery reptile-like skin with large quills running down its back, complete with sharp fangs and often a venom-style tongue. Now, my main challenge with this one is figuring out whether the skin is reptilian scaly or just reptilian-like from a distance. The reason for that is that many of the skeletal descriptions sound very mammalian. Now, this isn't to say that certain reptiles weren't bipedal and possibly hopped around with quills running down its back, but considering the direction that sauropsids took since the KPG mass extinction, a mammal seems more likely. In fact, most sightings have been disregarded as sightings of wild dogs afflicted with mange, a dermal infection caused by mites that cause sores, infection and extreme hair loss. Another warning, this next picture is of a wild dog afflicted with mange showing hairlessness and a crusty scaly appearance from the infection. Now, I'm showing you guys to illustrate what could be mistaken for a Chupacabra, but if you are a dog lover, look away now. Now, as you can see, this eventually makes the dog completely hairless, and the scabs and subsequent infections end up giving that leathery, scaly appearance. As for the hopping, who knows? This infection is a mammalian one with many variants, so maybe it could also infect another unknown placental mammal that has convergently evolved a kangaroo's locomotion. As for the blood-sucking, well, sanguivores are not limited to Bram Stoker novels. In fact, they're really common. Just take a look at mosquitoes, leeches, and the infamous vampire bats. Now, this method of feeding is more common in invertebrates, but vertebrates like the aforementioned bat and even the vampire finch are known to feed on the blood of other animals. One issue we run into here is that any animal, bony or otherwise, who are obligate blood feeders do not do so by predation. These are all parasitic organisms, remaining small and feeding on live animals without really even hurting them all that much, let alone killing them. So I don't think we're looking at a sanguivore here. But the Chupacabra has been reported to take the organs of livestock too, so maybe it's more of a traditional carnivore that favours offal? Now, there are so many more cryptids that I want to get into, but this video is pretty long already, and I intend to be here for many more Halloweens to come. So I'll make this a yearly tradition and go through other cryptids next year, so be sure to let me know down below what you'd like to see. But before I do close off, I want to mention 2 more cryptids. The reason I finger quoted that is because these were 100% real and 100% definitely seen by humans. The first are thylacines, or Tasmanian tigers. Thylacines are an extinct species of marsupial from Australia, Tasmania and New Guinea. Now, these poor guys were hunted relentlessly by humans as they were seen as threats to livestock, until the only known thylacines left were in captivity, late enough for footage to be taken of them. Now, the last known Tasmanian tiger died at Hobart Zoo in 1936 and has been officially declared extinct. But sightings have been reported since then. Now, these accounts haven't been proven, but the reason I put this to one side is because it is one of the few that we have actual proven video evidence of and didn't die out all that long ago. Again, the last known thylacine died, but maybe there are many more out there that did avoid detection, much like the second one I'm going to mention here, the coelacanth. Doesn't seem that exciting, does it? It's a fish. Well, coelacanths are a group of lobe-finned fish, which means they're more closely related to us tetrapods than other fish, and are benthic nocturnal feeders. Now, only coming out onto the seafloor at night has meant that they've avoided human detection for, get this, 66 million years. Yeah, we thought an entire group went extinct along with the dinosaurs, and it turns out they somehow avoided fossilization and detection right up until their rediscovery in 1938. Now, the odds of this happening are astronomically low, and they only get lower when you start talking about terrestrial or freshwater megafauna. The reason I wanted to bring these two up is to say that cryptozoology might be a pseudoscience, but it shouldn't be disregarded altogether. You might think it takes a fool to obsess over supposed fantasies with extreme bias and paranoia, but I think someone is equally as foolish if they think that we humans know everything about our world. Because trust me, we don't. Happy Halloween, and I'll catch you guys next time.